At this point, usually I chit chat with Chris, but Chris is sick. So if you're listening, tell Chris you hope he feels better and that you miss him, because I certainly do. But today I am joined by a special guest, one I am very excited to have join us. Luca, I'm going to let you introduce yourself because I will probably also butcher your last name.
Hey, thanks for having me. Hi, Chris. I hope you will feel better soon. My name is Luca Guidi. I'm a Ruby developer from Rome, Italy. You may know me probably for my open source contributions, mainly Redis Store in the past, and now Hanami, which is a full stack web framework for Ruby, of course.
Awesome. So I just kind of want to jump in. And before we kind of get to Hanami and I guess even Ruby, I just wanted to know, how did you get started in programming?
Oh, I'm a kind of a cliche programmer, if you want. I sparked my interest in computers and technology since I was a kid with the video games first. In the 80s. By the way, I'm wearing a Nintendo T-shirt right now. I know you cannot see that, but that is the kind of cliche I was talking about. And that was Nintendo first when I was a kid, and then I've got my first computer class after the elementary school, and since there I started to program with basic the language, and then I grew up, and the passion for computers, for programming, is still burning as we speak right now. I went to the university, picked computer science, but then I dropped out because in the meantime I started doing a full job, still with programming, and since then never stopped.
Awesome. We share we share a similar experience in the going to university and then getting a job and dropping out.
Yeah. Ironically, I didn't pass the exam of web development.
Really?
Yeah, that was. I was in the middle of my university career, and then was this professor that used to teach C, the language, and he was moved from C to web development. He was kind of frustrated by that change in his career, and then started to um, basically do an exam where nobody passed. And at that time I was already doing web development, and I said, okay, university is not for me, I'm done with this shit, and just drop out. So
All right.
yeah.
Yeah. I always struggled with math, and I don't think it's from like a lack of being able to do math. I think I was just really lazy and didn't apply myself. But I was in a data structures and algorithms class, and the other people in my class were in like linear algebra and all these like really advanced maths, and I was still in like college math, which in the US is like a prerequisite to get into any other math class. So yeah, maybe this isn't working.
Yeah.
Cool. So we kind of have your history of, getting into programming. I want to know when you got into Ruby and kind of what led your career into that.
Oh, um, we are talking a lot of years ago. I was doing Java as a junior dev, and for a few years, and I was classic enterprise environment where I used to work for. At the time, I was working as a consultant for a big consultancy firm for the Italian highway company, and it was a
Okay.
classic, enterprise environment where there was, those legacy Java projects, and from one day to another, hey, just maintain those projects, and they were uh, not well written, and without any framework. And Java to me was too intimidating, let's say, because I didn't grasp at the time OOP or interfaces, for instance. So I ended up for doing my job basically to get a result from something, casting 3 times a value, and all that headaches that come from not well written OOP in languages where there is a strong typing. So when I discovered Ruby, I said, "Oh, really? There are no data types, not types enforced in this language. Oh, I want to learn more." And I since then I said, "Okay, I want to use Ruby as a main language," and that happened. We are talking about 2006. I remember I discovered Ruby through Rails and Rails through Scriptaculous, which used to be an old JavaScript framework, and there was this little banner in this Scriptaculous website. There was Rails 0.13, something like that. So it was a pre 1.0 era, and I discovered that by reading the DHH book that he wrote with Dave Thomas for Prog, and then the Pickaxe Ruby book, and then that's my history with Ruby.
Wow. So that the Rails book, is that the Agile Web Development with Rails book?
That one, exactly.
Wow. I didn't know that existed like pre 1.0, because that book is still around. Like they upgraded every Rails version.
Oh, okay.
So you're into Ruby. One thing I kind of want to ask here is, so you've written a lot of articles about kind of like architecture and software. You've also created an entire like web framework, which we'll also get into in a little bit. But you mentioned you made the shift from kind of like from Java into Ruby, and that was kind of early on in your career. What kind of led you to like learn about, for lack of a better term, software architecture and patterns? Was that all in Ruby, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, mainly all the time. Since I switched to Ruby, I of course tend to improve myself as a programmer, because I recognize that I was still a junior developer. I want to learn more about computer programming, and then I started to get into the classic books like everything Martin Fowler wrote, and so on. So that was my kind of basics of foundations of my improvement, of my path to the seniority, if you wish. And then it was the realization on my day job that say, okay, this is not working properly. It's hard to maintain this piece of software. Let's see how can I apply the knowledge that I'm reading on the books to improve the software, and that worked most of the times. And then it was mainly with Ruby. But then lately, in the last few years, because I'm doing as part of my job, I read some Go code. I started to look at a completely different language and start to learn how can the principles of Go can be applied to Ruby as well. Not something really specific, but spreading the day job into different languages helps you to keep a fresh eye on Ruby.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's been kind of a thing I'm learning lately too, because in the day I just work in Ruby, but like last couple of years, like not everybody, a lot of people talk about like functional programming, and they start to like, it's like it's being rediscovered, and people are kind of preaching the benefits. And there's a lot of things I'm like learning, like paradigms in there that I kind of like, I start to apply in Ruby. And, you can't just like pick up functional programming and just like put it into Ruby, but things like dry RB and ROM and things like that. And even some of the Hanami stuff, like it's starting to like make me feel like I'm writing, different Ruby and sometimes better Ruby.
Oh, thank you. Speaking of functional approach, let's say in Ruby, I started looking as well. Also because I we are doing a really close collaboration with the Dry and ROM since a few years now, and I discovered that basically nasty bugs that may happen in large applications are sometimes due to um, unnoticed mutation of objects. So having borrowing one of the principles from functional programming like immutability helps you to reduce the amount of bugs. Or another, structuring the objects following a strict pattern of um, passing dependencies to the initializer of an object and params to the main method, which usually is call, helps you to draw a line in distinguish between the dependencies and what is the data that you are passing on and you are manipulating. That clear distinction, uh, helped me a lot in my day job, where I partly use Anami to write better maintainable Ruby code in general.
That's awesome. Yeah, I can't remember if it's Tim Riley. I can't remember who it is exactly. Somebody has a talk on like functional programming in Ruby, or like applying those principles, and they talk about when you have like a Ruby class and you give the dependencies like initialization. So whether that's like the constructor or some kind of like container or like dependency injection, they talk about you have this object that's like reusable because the like if you're doing any kind of like action on it, you're sending all the params through in a method, and so this object is just like instantiated once and called over and over again with different arguments. And I think that's so fascinating.
Yeah, we are. By the way, we are modeling Hanami around this principle, and I gave a talk as well last year, I guess, in Moscow. And explained why that is important, and to structure apps like that, and how we are going to follow those principles and apply to Hanami. It's I really recommend that, not because I gave the talk, but because I start the presentation with just explaining call the functions in terms of procs or a method that responds to call, and I dive inside the details of side effects, immutability, and so on. But everything is Ruby. Everything is simple. It's I take baby steps to get through that, and I recommend that if you are looking into are interested into functional programming applied to Ruby.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really exciting to hear. So we've kind of talked about kind of some things coming in Hanami. Before we dig more into that, I want to ask what inspired you to write, I guess at the time, Lotus, now Hanami. What kind of led you to do that?
Well, I recognize that Rails architecture had limits in terms of in terms of maintainability of large apps. I think Rails is a great framework for starting new projects, but you are left alone when this project is 1 year old, or even older. So sometimes. Okay, sorry, I had a problem with the computer. Sorry. um, I was saying you are left alone, kind of left alone. The Rails doctrine, if you want, it's valid only for the bootstrap of the project, but you're a little bit alone. And I've seen the Rails way applied to large code bases, and they turn to be, if you are not a disciplined team, you end up with a huge mass of controllers that are long 1,000 lines of code and so on. So I said, okay, let's not just complain about this, but let's do something useful for the community, just to, as an experiment, to show that it's possible to do otherwise, to think about maintainability since day zero of your project without sacrificing productivity. So I started to say, okay, let's do this, experiment, and that turned into Lotus and then Hanami.
That's awesome. One thing you said I really appreciate is you were like, let's do something that's not just complaining. let's turn this into code, and I think that's cool. So while we're there, so you start kind of experimenting. What are some of the kind of key things, at least starting off? I know you've learned a lot probably the last few years, but starting off, what are some of kind of the key things you said, this is how I want to be different from Rails?
Okay, again, maintainability. That means, for instance, one trivial thing. What I think is it's important: the lack of proper views in Rails. That I've seen ERB files cluttered over and over. I said, okay, this is not the way to go. Let's give a kind of backend for a template and assign a view object that is a kind of context for rendering a template. That is one thing that was clear in my mind since day zero. And another thing was about the separation of vertical slices in your project. I worked on projects that had inside the same code base and same the Rails app, the user-facing website / the user-facing app / the admin panel / the API and so on, and
Right.
several products, everything crammed inside the same repository without a clear separation of those. So the idea of support vertical slices inside Hanami was something that I want to support since day zero. So you have a separation of those but it's a clear separation. And the day you say, hey, this is not gonna scale anymore, you can pick that slice, extract into a separate repository, into a separate server, whatever, but it's ready for extraction. Yeah, that was one of the two elements that are on top of my mind.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think the first time I ever worked with Hanami, I was still pretty early in my career, even as a Rails developer. But I remember sitting down, and there were, I think, 3 things that kind of stood out to me. And I tried to give a talk on it one time, and it was kind of about these things. The separation of view and template is really I really enjoy that, because there's a lot of times in Rails apps, there is no layer between the two, and so I end up using something like a decorator or presenter, kind of as I don't want to put these view related methods on the model, and I don't really want to make a bunch of Rails helpers. So yeah, I really appreciated that. And also, like you said, the separation of apps, that never really occurred to me before that, because there's a lot of times I was building these admin panels, and they weren't separate apps. They were just namespaces. So the user facing app is in the root directory, and then there's an admin directory that has a whole nother world inside of it. And then, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, apart from the mess that it may happen when you're in a fast-pacing world like startups world, it may happen that you commit a lot of sins, if you wish, to just cram code over code, features of features. But the point is, where you allow you're too permissive as a framework, then there can be a kind of abuse, if you want, from developers. Whereas a framework that has more strict boundaries helps you in the long term, I believe. And again, I support with Anami the concept of monolith first, which is something that still Martin Fowler bring to the computer science community. That means go ahead and write your monolith, because it's the fastest thing that you can do for your company. But then I still believe that there is a in the long run, after 5 years of a monolith, you might want to consider to have a better structure of your infrastructure of your product. And then is the time when you want to say, hey, to thank your framework, because it allowed you to draw a line since the first day you wrote that project.
Yeah, that's awesome. The third thing for me was, I remember sitting down, like looking at the controller section, and each controller action is its own like class. And I was like, this feels so good. Like little tiny pieces that are like kind of singular focus. I would love to kind of hear like how you went with that structure, like why you went with that versus having one big controller file with a bunch of actions.
Because I didn't like big controllers. No, I'm joking.
Right.
Yeah, the point is that with large controllers, you end up having a lot of private methods that are used, with by one action or another action and so on. So there is no single purpose of a controller. Whereas if you shape around for each endpoint, you have an object. Everything that is in that object is useful for serving that HTTP request, and they are much easier and much easier to test, and much lightweight to be loaded for the Ruby process. So still today, I have to explain this distinction, but to me, really, it feels more natural to have one endpoint, one object, rather than a bunch of endpoints assigned to the same objects. To the same object, which is a Rails controller. It feels unnatural to me. It's more, again, natural to have one endpoint, one route, one object, one relationship. That's it.
Yeah, it's great. It's a pain point I didn't realize I had until I saw that. And another thing I think too, like when I'm like testing applications or specifically Rails applications, like I dread testing controllers because there's usually like so much in that world that you have to test. So yeah, it's cool.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Another point that this is a kind of answer to the other question before, the difference between Rails and Anami. That was another pain point for me, testing controllers or actions, whatever you want to call them. Here I want to say I don't want to expose I want to expose objects to the end developers so they can pick those objects and do whatever they want to do. And in this case, you instantiate an action and you unit test it without simulating HTTP request. That makes your life much, much easier because you pass a hash that simulates your params that you get from the actual real request, and you invoke call, and that's it. I want to make the life easier to developer, again, exposing objects as a main API of the framework.
It's so refreshing. So real quick, we mentioned Lotus. I think if anybody's listening not familiar, do you want to explain kind of the name change from Lotus to Hanami real quick?
Yeah, that happened 3 years ago. I called it Lotus because I liked the name. I have a tattoo with a lotus flower in it. It's long tattoo on my left arm, and I said, okay, I know about Lotus has been well famous piece of software, but that is for office automation. This is a web framework. Uh, People can tell the difference. And then I've
Right.
got I've got an issue over GitHub issue tracker of an employee of IBM and say, hey, I've got confused when I saw your name, this framework, because I don't know if you know, but IBM is has a web framework around Lotus, their office thing, and this may generate confusion for people. So, to be honest, I never considered that a potential name clash. But then I've been in touch with a lawyer. She's specialized in the copyright, computer, open source cases and so on, and she advised to change the name because at that time it was very unlikely that IBM can sue me. But she said it's your copyright works like this. The trademark is registered per industry, so they are in the right position. They registered the Lotus term as in computer in software long time ago, and you cannot eventually register that copyright. That was the first point. The second point, if you become famous, she said, you always need to explain that it's Lotus not from IBM, but it's the Ruby framework. So it's like, founding I don't know, a techno project, a techno music project, and call it the Queen. So you have always to explain that you are the Queen techno project and not the Queen rock band, just to give you a music analogy. So I said, okay, let's change the name. And luckily on my tattoo, I also have cherry blossom. And
Okay.
I decided to call it Hanami, which is a Japanese word that is a holiday that happens in the beginning of April, and where people, families, friends, and relatives go together on the outdoor to have to spend time looking the cherry blossom to cherry trees to blossom. And this name is a kind of a bridge between the Western Ruby community and the Japanese one, because we don't talk too much each other. So it's a kind of bridge of homage to maths and the fact that Ruby was born in Japan, and we tend to forget about that.
That's awesome. I actually didn't even know all that. That's really cool. So we're at Hanami now, and my next question is: how's the reception from the Ruby community to another web framework in Ruby?
Uh, well, it's again, it's hard to explain those kind of points because people find Rails so convenient, and don't forget that Rails is a framework that is emulated also in other languages. They still today they try to build Rails in another language, so it's hard to communicate the value of Anami over time. But we have a decent community. I hope that this community can get bigger over time. And for people, I received over the time this question: if I want to air quotes kill Rails, it's not my goal, but it's just to give the community, to single developers, companies, two options. One can be Rails and one can be Hanami. the reception, I mean the adoption, of course, they are not even comparable, but from time to time we are getting bigger.
Yeah, that's great. That's a kind of thing too I've been thinking about a lot recently is, like both can coexist. It would actually be, um, to me, it would be kind of a bummer if like Rails was the only way. Like we have no room in the Ruby community for anything else. So yeah.
Yeah, that kind of being just with a one option is not healthy for communities, for democracies, and so on. So it's good to have other ways to build web apps in this case.
So now we're kind of at this point where I want to ask. So you're on the verge of releasing Hanami 2.0, right?
Yeah, the alpha version will be out later this month. With a narrow set of features that we have right now in 1.3. Beware, this is just an alpha version, a kind of preview of the principles that we are applying to the framework. So it won't be fully functional, but you get an idea, a sense of the direction of the framework. And again, we are applying all the principles that we discussed in this during this chat. That means a blend of functional approach. We try to use immutability as much as possible. In the first place, to avoid nasty bugs that are hard to trace, to encourage multi-threading in some cases, and also to reduce the memory footprint of the web application. By doing so, basically freezing all the objects that belong to the framework and reusing over and over for each incoming request. Sorry.
I was just saying that's cool.
Oh, thanks. I didn't run benchmarks yet because it would be silly to do at this point, at this stage of the development. But I feel confident. I rewrote the router as well because it was depending on HTTP router, which at this point is maintained. It's an old gem, and this new version is much faster. And by using those principles, it's also faster than 1.0. We will see how it goes for the whole Hanami projects.
That's exciting. So there was, I think it was a blog post when 1.3 released, and it said, moving forward, we're focusing on 2.0, and we're also kind of, and you mentioned this earlier, like deeply working with like the DryRB team and the ROM team for this release. Do you have maybe some specific examples of, how you're working with them and maybe on what you're working with them?
Yes, absolutely. We are already in the 1.3, since 1.0 series, we had an integration with both ROM and dry libraries. We try to to facilitate the access to those libraries that sometimes can be hard to grasp. But now what we are doing is basically on the dry side is to reuse as much as possible the libraries that Dry is offering. The goal is to reach the maturity of that ecosystem. So we are using Hanami as an example of how dry gems can reach the maturity in terms of adopting them. For instance, for the configuration, we are planning to use dry configurable. So it would be tight. We will kind of will be kind of first citizens for the dry ecosystem, and that helps to get dry more mature, but at the same time for us to reduce the repetition of libraries of maintenance effort that we have between Hanami, Dry, and ROM. So dry is for the low-level stuff. I recently wrote an inflector library directly on the dry ecosystem because it made more sense to live under their ecosystem, and we are directly adopting it, and that reuses code from Hanami utils, for instance, and we are dropping that part of Hanami utils to have just one focused effort on inflections, for instance. And the other part is the view layer of Hanami would be based on dry view. That brings the experience of the dry community, but also the experience will be driven by the experience of Hanami. So we will basically drop what we have right now. Team is rewriting the view layer, and then basically it would be the same thing. Dry view and Hanami view will be the same thing, but you will still see the Hanami namespace, but it would be the same thing. So we are trying to merge stuff that is clearly overlapping with dry. With ROM, the fact that we integrated ROM for the repositories and dry types for the entities helped a lot ROM to understand how to improve usability. And the plans for ROM 5 are to try to port features from Hanami repository, from Hanami model directly into ROM to facilitate the newcomers to use ROM directly. So they would be close given the experience that we matured in those years of Hanami.
That's really awesome. It sounds like the three kind of projects working together is actually, in a way, helping each individual project on its own. And that's really neat.
Yeah, that's what's happening, and we discuss every day about how we can improve the libraries and the design of the code. We are kind of I don't want to say the same team at this point, but we are still keeping the individual ecosystem as they are, but we are going in the same direction, working day by day basis towards that goal.
That's great. I only have a couple more questions for you, and hopefully they're a little more brief. Do you find yourself working in any Rails applications these days?
Yeah, work is my day job. I work for the NS Simple. We have the flagship product is a Rails app. Inside that, there is a Hanami mounted in it, which powers the API. So I work more on the back end of the things, both on the API and the back end of code. So lately, I don't see any UI, any Rails specific thing, and I'm happy working on the back end. So yeah, the ecosystem is still Rails, but I work mainly with Ruby, and as I said, with a few things with Go.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And the other question I had, and we can kind of wrap up around this one. So you're working at Go Summit Work. You have what I assume to be some experience in other languages outside Ruby. What kind of keeps you, in 2019 still using Ruby?
Oh, I love it. That's the main reason. I still feel comfortable, and to be honest, if I have to look back at how Ruby was when I started using it, it's a completely different language in some ways, and the core team of Ruby is doing a great job, not just improving speed, but trying to adopt some principles that I like. For instance, in Ruby 2.6 is the composition of procs, which is screams for functional programming, and
Right.
the language is getting better. I'm in a position where I still love it. I still I'm still comfortable with the language. I think it can be used for really in meaningful and successful ways. So I don't have any reason to switch to another language.
That's awesome. My goal this year more is to talk to people in the community, and there's a lot of I don't use Ruby anymore, but there's a lot of us who still use it, and so I just like to hear that. So
I've seen that you recently wrote a blog post about that, right?
I did, yeah. Just kind of, instead of being like, these are the things I don't like about Ruby, I was kind of like, here's why I still use it this year. So I actually lied. I have one more question. And hopefully it's a pretty simple question. If for anyone listening who wants to go start writing Hanami today, if they build a stable 1.3 app, do you kind of have in your mind what the upgrade story to a 2.0 app will look like?
It would be probably not an easy path, to be honest, but because there are differences. For sure, there would be differences, but we are taking this big leap between 1.3 to 2.0, and I feel and that would be the final step, the final shape for Hanami, in the sense that when I released 1.0, I was happy, of course, but to have reached that milestone. But I was sure that that wasn't the final shape, the final design of the project. Now I think we are reaching the point of maturity where the architecture will change a little bit. There will be again breaking changes, but don't be afraid about that. We have a great support. And I will do more and more videos to explain how to jump from 1.3 to 2.0. As any major release will be, again, not backward compatibilities, but that is for the good of the future of the project.
Sure. Awesome. I can't thank you enough for joining me. It's a project I keep my eye on. I haven't got to build Hanami projects part of a day job, but I absolutely admire from a distance everything you and the team are doing. So thank you for not only joining me, but for Hanami.
First of all, it was a pleasure to have this chat with you, and I think I am happy to help the Ruby community, to give back to the Ruby community, because again, I'm happy with the language. It's a fantastic language, great community, really friendly and welcoming. So it's my honor to give back to the community.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And for those listening, I will see you next week.
Bye.